1499 after 10 years with a military coup that brings Napoleon at the helm of the government. And he consolidates his powers and becomes in 1804 the first emperor of the First French Empire. Here's a painting by Jacques-Louis David that depicts the coronation of Napoleon. This is a big ceremony with the Pope being there and all. And during that ceremony, Napoleon actually crowns himself. So he takes the crown and puts it on his own head, and then he crowns his wife. Napoleon changes France in many ways, and he changes Europe in many ways. So some of the domestic changes have to do with the church. The church is essentially invited back into its role it had before the French Revolution. So the Vatican is running the Catholic Church again. The education system gets modernized and streamlined because qualifications for positions is increasingly depending on merit and education. And so schools are being reorganized in a way that they produce better educated young men that are prepared for careers in government and learn professions. The economy gets modernized. All sorts of tax exemptions that are based on birth status and other special arrangements are being axed, and the government actually rests on solid treasury. Napoleon also invents and develops a law code, the Civil Code or Code Napoleon, which is still in use, or partially in use in many countries in Europe. And France becomes a socially bourgeois, legally egalitarian, and administratively bureaucratic state. Napoleon also changes Europe, and he changes Europe through a series of wars. Those wars really start during the French Revolution, so the Revolutionary Wars that make Napoleon a known figure and bring him a lot of popularity in France. They simply continue and are now Napoleon's wars. There are 5 main players during these wars. These are the 5 main powers at the time: France, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. And it takes these players 7 main wars or coalitions until they finally manage to defeat France. So Napoleon will be successful for most of the time until 1814. So it took really a long time to unite Napoleon's opposition. I will browse through these coalitions pretty quickly. The main point I want to make here is that they were shifting. So you have, on the one hand, in the first coalition, for example, you have the Habsburg monarchy, the Holy Roman Empire, which still exists, together with Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, Portugal, and some other countries fighting against France and Spain, and some French satellite states. And France, as in the next few years, will be victorious here. So this is the coalitions of the First Revolutionary War. And France will be successful and will annex other parts of other countries. Whenever there's a peace settlement during these wars, it tends to be very brief. So the next war starts only a year or 2 after the first one ends, and also ends in a French victory. France reaffirms its authority over the annexed territory. And here you see, for example, that Russia is part of this war against France. The third coalition once again ends in French victory in the Treaty of Pressburg. What gets decided is that the Holy Roman Empire dissolves. So finally, the Holy Roman Empire is gone. This is after about depending on when you start counting, but it's around the year 900 or so that the Holy Roman Empire starts. So this entity, I don't really want to call it state, is finally gone. In its place, what gets created is the Confederation of the Rhine, which will later be absorbed by Prussia to form Germany. During this time, Napoleon realizes that he cannot defeat England militarily, so what he tries to do is to cripple it economically, and to do so he bans all imports of British goods into any European ports in the Berlin Decree from 1806. Portugal refuses to join the blockade, and so Napoleon invades the Iberian Peninsula. This will result in a 5-year guerrilla war, which will raise all sorts of nationalist feelings in other European countries. And ultimately, this continental blockade or the continental system is a failure for Napoleon. The Fourth Coalition once again ends in French victory. Here, look at who is fighting France, Prussia, Russia, the United Kingdom, Sweden and Sicily. Saxony is first against and then with France. And on the other side, you have France, the empire, and then French satellite states, including Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony. So we'll see that unifying Germany later in that century, which will be done by Prussia, is a bit of a complicated process because different parts of what will become Germany are fighting against each other during the Fourth Coalition and other Napoleonic wars as well. The Fifth Coalition, once again, French victory, and this really is when France is at its height of its power. After the Fifth Coalition, the main enemy remains England, but that's about it. There's also the peninsular problems, but the key country fighting France at this point is simply the United Kingdom. And so in 1812, at the height of Napoleon's empire, or French Empire, the map in Europe looks like this. France is dark green and its satellites are this light green. So really the French Empire reaches from Spain all the way to Poland, essentially. And other countries are allies through marriage and such. And the few remaining French enemies are Great Britain, Portugal, Sweden, and Russia. And the next thing that Napoleon will do, and that will ultimately lead to his demise, is the invasion of Russia in the year 1812. Napoleon enters Russia with an army of something like 400 to 700,000 soldiers, about a third of which are French. The other ones are from the occupied or allied countries. And the Russians, by and large, react by retreating and pursuing a scorched earth tactics. So you would burn everything and then retreat. And while there are battles along the way, Napoleon advances all the way to Moscow, but Moscow is essentially empty, and so eventually he has to return. And along the way, both towards Moscow and out of Moscow, back to Poland, essentially, most of the army that Napoleon put together will perish. And this becomes a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. From now on, the coalition forces will actually win the wars until Napoleon is finally defeated in the Battle of Nations at Leipzig in 1813. There's a very famous figure that summarizes Napoleon's Russian campaign. It is by Charles Minard, a statistician. And this figure combines a lot of information into one figure, the number of Napoleon's troops, the distance that they travel, the temperature, the latitude and longitude, and the direction of travel, as well as some specific events at specific dates. So in the grand scheme of things, what you see here is this bar is the invasion of Russia, and as it becomes smaller, you have fewer and fewer soldiers, so soldiers die. On the way back, that's the black depicted here, you see that the army is thinning out even more. You also see that they're largely forced to go through the same areas, and then when the army completely retreats, it's almost entirely gone. What you also see is here the temperature. This is in Celsius. So you see as the army retreats, so this is relative to the retreat, these temperatures, the temperature drops. So it's a brutal winter with minus 20, minus 30 degrees in Celsius. So France adopts the metric system during the French Revolution. So we're talking about Celsius. So minus 30 Celsius is something like minus 22 Fahrenheit. So it's really very cold. Here's a slightly more easily readable version of this map, so you can actually see the numbers. So according to this map, we see that the Napoleonic army is about 400,000 soldiers. I mentioned before 700,000, 400,000 to 700,000. We don't really know all that exactly. And you see how quickly it perishes as they go to Moscow. About 100,000 troops reach Moscow, and then on the retreat, you're left with barely 4,000 soldiers. Someone took the trouble of putting this onto Google Map, which is here. And if you see someone hang this in their office, you're almost guaranteed to deal with a statistics snob. The invasion of Russia clearly is a turning point for Napoleon, but it's not the only reason for his decline or the decline of the French Empire. There are several events, starting with the Battle of Trafalgar, in which the French fleet is defeated by the British fleet, making it impossible for Napoleon to militarily threaten England, which is why he devises the continental system, the blockade of British goods. But that system actually weakens the French and European economies, and it hurts them more than it hurts the British ones, because the British Empire has lots of markets overseas. The Peninsular War also shows that Napoleon can deal with the guerrilla warfare that arises in Spain and Portugal, and he loses an enormous amount of soldiers, over 300,000 troops in that nasty war. And other countries see that he is actually not invincible and develop a sense of desire for self-government and nationalism. And invading Russia then clearly depletes the army and shows that Napoleon actually can lose wars. And so he will. In the Sixth Coalition, that is the Sixth War from 1812 to 1814, you now see that finally everybody is united against France, or almost everybody. So you have on the one hand Russia, Prussia, Austria, the United Kingdom, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden fighting the French Empire, and they do this successfully with a decisive battle in Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. And so the coalition forces win, and after that we will see the Congress of Vienna and a restoration of the Bourbon monarchs, so the Louis XIV, 15, 16 were Bourbons, and now they will come back. Louis XVI is executed in the French Revolution, Louis XVII is his son. He dies in prison, 10 years old, and then Louis XVIII will be the next king in France. There are various territorial changes after the Sixth Coalitions, and the Congress of Vienna starts. The Congress of Vienna gets interrupted. Napoleon is captured and exiled to Elba, but he escapes and returns to power for 100 days. But then finally he is defeated in 1815 once and for all. The 100 days are the Seventh Coalition, and you see that everybody now is against France, and France suffers decisive defeat in the Battle of Waterloo. In the Congress of Vienna, which starts in 1815, the main decision makers are the countries from the Quadruple Alliance: Austria, Prussia, the Russian Empire, and the United Kingdom. And what the Congress of Vienna does is it erects a barrier of strong nations along the French Eastern Front to contain it, and it restores monarchies, the Bourbons in Spain and the Braganzas in Portugal, and it also puts the Bourbon king on the French throne. The only area in which the Congress really did not meddle all that much are the Germanic states, which had been reorganized by Napoleon. This is a map of the national boundaries within Europe as set by the Congress of Vienna, and you see that France is now somewhat smaller, and more importantly, you see the boundary of the German Confederation here, which will be an area that now in the 19th century will be sorted out. What will happen is that Prussia up here will lead the unification of some German states to Germany, and in Italy we'll see a similar event, which is the unification of Italy, but it happens in a different fashion, as we will see. So the result of the Congress of Vienna is essentially a reaction, conservative reactions. Monarchies are restored. We see an increase in power of Britain and Prussia, and we see an increase in nationalism throughout Europe. In many ways, nationalism is a reaction to Napoleon and the occupation of European territory by French troops. So what we see is that the countries that were occupied develop anti-French sentiments. These sentiments fuel nationalism, the idea of self-determination, and things like that. And therefore you can understand the nationalistic movements that are now emerging and becoming really strong and powerful in the 19th and early 20th century really start off as anti-French movements. Nationalism is an ideology, but it is hard to place within the normal frames of how we sort ideologies. Typically we distinguish classical ideologies, and there the three classical ideologies are liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. We could add nationalism, anarchism, and fascism, but most scholars aren't ready to do that. There are more recent ideologies such as feminism or multiculturalism, but those we will not discuss. So whether nationalism is an ideology or not is a hotly contested question in the literature. The problem with nationalism is that it really can morph or attach itself to all the other main ideologies. So it has been sometimes progressive, sometimes reactionary, sometimes democratic, sometimes authoritarian, sometimes rational, sometimes irrational, sometimes left-wing, and sometimes right-wing. And so you really find nationalism attached to all sorts of things, including liberalism, conservatism, fascism, and socialism. Therefore, some people would call it a political doctrine rather than an ideology or a chameleon ideology, not an ideology in its own right. What is it? Well, nationalism at its heart is the simple belief that the nation is the natural and proper unit of government. And as mentioned, its origin is closely tied to the developments in France. First, the idea of nationalism is born during the French Revolution, where Frenchmen or where peasants get transformed into Frenchmen, where people are turned from subjects of the crown to French citizens. And all of that is fueled by this new idea of nationalism. This spreads during the Napoleonic Wars and the French occupation, with the anti-French sentiment leading to nationalistic feelings in other European countries, which then will be expressed as large desires for independence. We see in 1848 a set of revolutions throughout Europe, and many of these revolutions really are nationalist uprisings. So when we talk about ideologies and when they emerge, here is a summary. We see that liberalism emerges as a reaction to the status quo of absolutism, conservatism as a reaction to the French Revolution, nationalism as a reaction to French occupation, and socialism as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. Nationalism has changed over time. At the beginning, it was associated with liberal and progressive movements. It put a lot of weight on flags, national anthems, patriotic poetry and literature, public ceremonies and national holidays and such. However, increasingly nationalism will be taken over historically by conservative and reactionary politicians, and they will stress social cohesion, order and stability, and they will present nationalism as an alternative to the growing challenge of socialism. In its more extreme forms, nationalism becomes chauvinistic and xenophobic, and it's a small step then to superiority claims of each nation. And we will see these claims in the 19th and 20th century, and in many ways we see in World War I the culmination of nationalism. I want to discuss 4 core themes or values of nationalism. The first one is the nation, the other ones are organic community, self-determination, and identity politics. With respect to the nation, the idea of nationalism is that the nation is or should be the central principle of political organization. What is a nation? A nation is a cultural entity. It's a collection of people that belong together, and they are bound together by shared values and traditions, typically a common language, a common religion, and a shared history. And they're typically living in the same geographical area. So nationalism really is about some form of ethnic or racial unity. It makes sense here to discuss the distinction between states and nations. So a state is a sovereign political power over a given territory. Many states that exist are multinational, and a good example is the United Kingdom that combines several nations or former monarchies under one state. The nation, however, is a cultural entity, and cultural means mainly language, a common religion, often a common history that often is invented. And so people in a nation are supposed to feel, have a common sense or shared idea of a common heritage. And examples would be the English nation, the Welsh nation, the Scottish nation, and the Northern Irish nation, which are combined into the United Kingdom. So a nation-state is the overlap between a common cultural group and sovereign political unit. This is a good, detailed quote from the Palmer textbook, and I invite you to read it. The second core theme of nationalism is organic community. The basic idea is that humankind is naturally divided into nations, into a collection of nations, and each of these nations possesses their own national character. And you can see that very quickly this leads to stereotyping and leads to a comparison of characters and claims of superiority of one character over another. And we will see that nationalism fuels those comparisons. Nationalism believes that nationhood is a more fundamental bond within a society than other potential bonds such as class, gender, religion, or language. A third theme of nationalism is the idea of self-determination, that government is carried out either by the people or for the people in accordance with their national interests. The fourth core theme of nationalism is identity politics, which plays an important role in all sorts of versions of nationalism. Nationalism tells people who they are, and in order to be able to do this, it often relies on history that's sometimes constructed. It suggests social bonds, collective spirits, and a sense of destiny derived from a nation. And this is a difficult task to achieve. How do you get a bunch of people that have no natural bond with each other, that don't know each other, to believe in a nation and to be willing to fight and die for a nation? And so if you want to put it very negatively, nationalism makes people believe in the same lie at the same time. But that's probably too harsh. It is hard to underestimate the importance of nationalism for development in Western Europe, especially in the 19th and early 20th century. It reshapes the map fundamentally. It leads to wars, and it will make new states and nations appear, and others will disappear. In particular, the idea of self-determination and nationalism creates great powers, and the examples there are Germany, which is unified from above, and Italy, which is unified from below in the 19th century. However, nationalism and the striving for self-determination based on some common bond, such as language, breaks up great powers. And the best examples in the 19th century and beyond is the Austrian Empire, which crumbles, and the Ottoman Empire, which also disappears. Nationalism plays a particularly important and decisive role in Germany, and a particularly destructive one. It was a popular concept with German scholars, philosophers, artists, arguably because there was no Germany. It starts out pretty progressive, if you want to put it that way. So important philosophers, German philosophers, come up with the idea of, or use the idea of a national spirit or Volksgeist. The brothers Grimm, that you know from some fairy tales, try to collect and do collect stories in the German language, or translate them into the German language to revive folk traditions. In music, we have Richard Wagner, who rediscovers or invents all sorts of myths and legends about Germany and Germans and how they're superior to other nations and races. And so in nationalism in Germany, there is, starting in the 19th century, an emphasis on the uniqueness of the German culture and its language, and then fairly quickly also an emphasis on the racial purity of its people. And that idea will be taken to its extreme when the Nazis will come to power in the 1930s.